Have you ever thought, why do I keep eating when I'm not even hungry?
Or maybe you're just overwhelmed by all the diets and wellness trends. It's chaotic out there. Hello, I'm Dr. Yan.
Hi, I'm Zoe, and welcome to Ask the Binge Eating Expert, the podcast where we get real about binge eating and healing your relationship with food.
We're the co-founders of ARCare, the #1 science-backed app helping people stop binge eating. We cut through the noise and tackle the real roadblocks to recovery without shame, without judgments.
Have you heard much about people using GLP-1 medications to help with binge eating?
I've mostly heard about them for weight loss. Are they really used for binge eating too?
Not officially, I think. Most people got them for diabetes or weight management, but I've read posts from online forum and few users of our app. They said that once they started the medication, the binge urges became way more manageable. After starting the medication, the mental noise that's a food talk dialed down.
So no more food chatter. That must have felt like such a shift.
They said it wasn't a magic fix. They still had to work through their rhythms and stress coping mechanisms, for example. But with fewer obsessive thoughts, they finally felt like they had the space to actually do the deeper work.
That's really encouraging. But I imagine it's not like that for everyone, especially given how complex binge eating is.
Definitely not. Others have said that, like in the same forum, it didn't help binging at all, and they experienced side effects.
That makes sense. I guess with like anything, it really depends on your body, your needs, and where you are in the process.
Yeah, it's not the answer for everyone, but I'm curious, and it's also very interesting that for some people, it really opened the door that they didn't expect.
Should we get into today's letter? I'm curious if this is something someone's wrestling with.
Let's do it.
I've been dealing with binge eating for a few years now. Some weeks it feels under control, but other times it really disrupts my life. I've tried things like therapy, journaling, and sticking to regular meals, and while those help a little, the urges still keep coming back. Lately, I've heard more about people using GLP-1 medications like Ozempic or Wegovy, not just for weight loss, but to help with emotional eating. I want to be really clear that I'm not looking for a quick fix. What I'm wondering is whether there's a place for medication like this as part of a broader treatment plan. Maybe something that could take the edge off enough for me to get by. Do GLP-1 medications help with cravings or impulse control, or do they just reduce hunger? If this isn't the right path, I'd love to hear what is recommended.
Thank you for writing in. There's so much care and thoughtfulness in how you're approaching this. You're not chasing a quick fix, but really trying to understand what might support you in a deeper way.
Totally. You've already been doing a lot therapy, journaling, regular meals, and now you're asking this really thoughtful question. Not, will this medication make everything go away? But could it possibly give me enough breathing room to make the other stuff work better? That's such a grounded and wise place to come from. And I think it's fair to want that because when binge urges are intense and persistent, even your best tools can feel out of reach. If something could soften the edge, that could be worth exploring.
Yeah, I also really appreciate that you're being cautious. You're not assuming GLP-1s are the answer. You're just wondering whether that might be helpful with things like impulse control.
Yeah, that distinction really matters. Instead of hoping something will magically fix everything, you're asking if it might create just enough space to reach for a journal, or pause, or breathe.
That's meaningful. Let's loop in Dr. Katherine, a doctor who specializes in eating disorders. I'm sure she'll have lots of insights on what these medications can do, what they can't, and how to make the decision from a place of self-care.
Yes.
Hey, Catherine. Today's topic is GLP-1 medicine, which is, I know it's a quite hot topic and controversial as well. So first question is, can GLP-1 medications actually help with binge eating, or are they only meant for diabetes or weight loss?
Yes, I think that's the billion-dollar question right now in my field, which is the eating disorder space. I know it is very controversial question. And part of it is because we just don't have good data to know long term, are these medications safe and effective for people who have active eating disorders? I think a lot of us in the eating disorder field are wary because we also know that weight loss in people who already have an active eating disorder can trigger an even more severe, potentially life-threatening eating disorder. So we're trying to be really careful with who we're recommending these medications for.
Right. And so maybe to kind of step back a little for the listeners who are not too familiar with GLP-1 medicine, how do GLP-1 medicines affect the brain? Do they change hunger signals or food cravings? How does it affect our brain and body?
We're still learning about the intricacies of the mechanism of the GLP-1 medications. What we do know is that for many people, it does decrease their hunger signals and decreases their appetite. Some people describe it as the food noise in my brain has gone down, just the desire to eat has gone down, which for some people might be a positive thing. I think the jury is still out on GLP-1s and what they do to this quote food noise, because I know a lot of people with binge eating disorder do report struggling with just thinking about food all the time. And, that's not pleasant. I think this is an area for future research. But again, because I'm coming from this eating disorder space where I have seen people who lose weight and then they develop a more severe eating disorder, a lot of people, I think, appropriately cautious about whether or not these medications are the right choice for somebody with an active eating disorder.
How do you think this medication might interact with intuitive eating and other recovery approaches if they are done in tandem?
Yes, we've talked about intuitive eating on prior episodes, and I'm a fan of intuitive eating for people who are able to kind of listen to those signals. And again, we talked also about how for certain people, particularly people who have not been getting in enough nutrition, their hunger signals may not be accurate. I won't say that I would never prescribe a GLP-1 medication for any of my patients. I think that would be too black and white thinking. But what I will say is that I think because we know that weight loss, especially rapid weight loss, can lead to medical complications and also trigger eating disorder behaviors in the brain. If somebody already has an active eating disorder and then you trigger rapid weight loss, I think those of us who practice in this field are worried that that might then exacerbate eating disorder symptoms or change the eating disorder into something much more dangerous. Unfortunately, most people who go to their regular medical provider don't get screened for eating disorders. If I could change the way this is being done, I would encourage people to actually screen for an active eating disorder before prescribing GLP-1 medications for their patients.
This concern that some experts have about GLP-1 medicine and eating disorder, do you think it's the same concern across different kinds of eating disorders, or do you think there's something more nuanced or special to be thought about for binge eating disorder specifically?
Great question. I think there's probably more reason to think it might be helpful for people with binge eating disorder because they do struggle with this food noise, a constant drive to eat, and it may help them with the binge eating episodes. With that said, we already have, a stimulant medication that can help with that as well. So I think I'm of the mindset that let's try what we do know works first. We do know getting into the right types of therapy, particularly CBT and DBT and binge eating focused therapy, can be helpful. So we should start with what we know works first before we start trying some medications that we just don't know the long-term impact, and we don't know how an individual person will respond to it. Most people without eating disorders are able to go on these medications and not develop a more serious eating disorder. But if you're already somebody who is struggling with an eating disorder, then that's why I think in the field we're kind of hesitant to prescribe these medications for most people. I also will say I've had patients who have an active diagnosis of anorexia nervosa who are constantly restricting, who have been successful at getting prescribed GLP-1 medications as well. It is not hard for people to get these medications. So that's something that we're having to think about too. How can we protect our patients from getting medications that may not be used appropriately in somebody with an active eating disorder.
You've mentioned stimulant medications that could be helpful for the food noises. Could you explain a bit more about potential other medications that can be considered to help the recovery of binge eating disorder?
The medication that is FDA approved for the treatment of binge eating disorders called Vyvanse. It's actually an ADHD stimulant medication. And I think we don't know exactly how it works, except we do know in cases of ADHD, there's some impulse control regulation issues. So the Vyvanse may help with impulse control related to food as well.
Gotcha. You mentioned that rapid weight loss could be one of the trigger for eating disorder. Could you maybe explain a bit more about how that can trigger eating disorder or some of the cases that you have seen?
Yes. I like to bring up one of the most interesting experiments that's happened in this field called the Minnesota starvation experiment. This was back in the 1940s, I believe. A bunch of volunteers who were conscientious objectors to World War II volunteered to participate in a study that could never be done today with the institutional review boards. In this study, they're all young men, healthy young men who were in their 20s, and they were put on an 1,800 calorie per day diet. And these young men starved. And what was fascinating was in this process, these healthy young men in the 1940s, there was something that triggered their brains to act as if they had active eating disorders. Many of them described cutting their food into very small pieces or being fearful of waking or feeling like they had to compulsively exercise. So this is really the best science we have, since we can't do studies like this today, that shows that there's something that happens in the brain when a brain loses weight very rapidly. We don't quite understand all the details of how it all works, but we do know that when somebody tends to lose weight really rapidly, it tends to exacerbate symptoms of restrictive eating disorders like anorexia nervosa. These young men who are otherwise healthy developed symptoms just by the fact that they were starved. Again, we don't have a lot of other ability to do trials like that today, but it was a very interesting study that can inform our practice even today.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
I've never heard of an experiment like that.
Right. And it's super interesting because I think a lot of people are aware or becoming aware of how restriction can fuel binges. So when you first started talking about it, I thought you were going to say after being restricted for so long, they developed some binge eating symptoms. But in fact, restriction and weight loss kind of begets like more restriction and more weight loss in this like anorexic way. That's super fascinating that that happens.
I agree with you. I think it is fascinating. And I guarantee you that is not at all what the researchers back in 1940 something were expecting. They didn't even have a name for anorexia nervosa in those days, but they were perplexed why these young, healthy men who had been starved were behaving in this way. They were compulsively exercising, restricting their intake, cutting their bite into very tiny little pieces, and really feared weight gain after being starved. So yeah, I think it does kind of speak to the biological basis of eating disorders.
Also, for me, what's interesting is like when you said 1,800 calorie, right? It doesn't sound like a dramatic restriction in some sense because it's still like a solid 1 or 2 meals, right? I was imagining like no food for 5 days and then you turn into this, yeah. But then, yeah, it's really surprising.
Yes, one of the doctors I used to work with, who's a leader in this field, used to put up a slide of these men after they had been starved, and they looked extremely malnourished. He would ask the medical students in the room, how many calories do you think these men were given to reach this state of complete starvation? And most of them would say, oh, 500 calories a day, 800 calories a day. And then I think everyone was kind of surprised when he said, actually, this is 1,800 calories a day because, we think, oh, well, that's enough for a lot of people. But for young, healthy men who were also doing some manual labor, it wasn't nearly enough for them. And they all reached a state of pretty extreme starvation.
I think that's such like an important nugget of information when, as you say, why
maybe we should be careful about GLP-1 medicine being used in conjunction with people who have eating disorder, or maybe even for people who don't have eating disorder, maybe you should still be careful.
To that point, we also have seen a large increase in people who have never had a history of an eating disorder, who have gone on GLP-1 medications, lost weight really rapidly, and then developed a restrictive eating disorder. That certainly is happening. And again, I don't think we have long-term data to show where this all goes and how often it's happening. But in our field, we do see it. And so I don't say that to scare people and say, oh, nobody should ever go on these medications. But I think it's an important phenomenon for people to be aware of, that we are seeing it. It does happen. Be monitored carefully medically if you are somebody who's going on to these medications.
Like, do you have any ideas when people would have some sort of a consensus around using this medications for eating disorder?
I think there is some data there for other conditions like diabetes, for instance. But for eating disorders, I think it's just starting to come out right now. I know there are some groups that are working on looking at the impact of GLP-1s on patients with active eating disorders. I just know anecdotally in our field, we are seeing cases that have arisen from these medications, or cases that have kind of been exacerbated by these medications. There are a few cases of people who have, particularly those with binge eating disorder, who maybe did find help in this. So, I think each patient needs to be treated as an individual. We can look at large populations and kind of generalize the trends, but at the end of the day, each individual patient has their own specific needs, and they need to be addressed individually as well. Oftentimes in clinical medicine, there can be some black and white thinking. There are definitely people out there who think that if you've ever had an eating disorder, or even if you're at risk of eating disorder, you shouldn't go near a GLP-1 medication. For certain individuals, that may be true. There's also probably some people who might be able to go on these medications and it might help them. We just don't know long-term for large populations what this may look like. And also we know that there have been cases of people getting triggered. We've seen them do harm, we've seen them do good, and we just don't have the long-term view yet on whether or not it's a recommended strategy in the treatment of binge eating disorder.
Would dosage of this medication also matter as well? I think I read somewhere that depending on the states or depending on the countries, the dosage of the GLP medicines vary a lot, and that could also lead to the long-term complications.
There's many different dosages. There's many different types of medications. Some people are microdosing these medications. So there's so many different ways they are being used. And again, I think we just don't have the information yet on what is most helpful for people, especially if they're struggling with an eating disorder.
Thanks for joining us. Make sure to subscribe to the Ask the Binge Eating Expert podcast so you never miss an episode. Have a question you want us to answer? Email us at askthebingeeatingexpert@gmail.com.
Please note, the advice provided on this podcast is not a substitute for professional treatment, therapy, or clinical care. If you're looking for additional support or want to take action on your own terms, check out the Our Care app, the #1 science-backed app for overcoming binge eating.